on their app.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, the murder of a black trans woman in Dorchester has gone unsolved for decades. But now the Boston police are promising to renew their investigation. Could there finally be justice for Rita Hester? Then the investigative reporter behind a new FRONTLINE documentary into the police response to the 2022 Uvalde, Texas school shooting. 25 years ago, a black trans woman named Rita Hester was stabbed to death in her Boston apartment. Her murderer was never found, and friends and family questioned whether police were really committed to solving this case, all of which sparked citywide protests and ultimately led to the creation of the Trans Day of Remembrance. Now, on the anniversary of her death, Boston police reaffirmed their commitment to solving Rita Hester's case, which was recently assigned a new detective. But as local trans activist Chastity Bowick told GBH News, there is a lot of mistrust of police among the trans community.
Thank God it's open again, but just an open case, are they going to do the work?
I'm joined now by Tori Bedford, who's been covering this story for GBH News with Kate Sosin, LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th News. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah, so Tori, I mean, I know that you've been reporting on this for some time. Talk to me a little bit about Chastity's story. I know she couldn't be here with us tonight.
Yeah, so unfortunately Chastity couldn't join us, but you know, she's a source, longest resume, you know, of the work that she's done with different kinds of trans advocacy and mentorship. And I think, you know, she, to us, kind of stood out as kind of the main character of this. There, obviously, you know, we're looking at Rita, and we're working at the same time on this video that's coming out next week, where we're kind of looking at the parallel of their lives. You know, they both had these challenges, had to engage in survival sex work, had, you know, just were treated and mistreated by the public and by the media and by the police. And Chastity is now just such a representative, such a great representative for the community, and has gone on to be, you know, lead these huge organizations. And I think when she looks back at her life and her journey, it's sort of, you know, what Rita would have perhaps wanted to do had she survived. Rita was a huge personality. She was very active and vocal, you know, back in the 90s, you know, she died in 98 for this community. And I think that, you know, her life was just taken too soon and very tragically, in the way that it's representative of so many deaths, right? Like, so many members of the trans community die from violence. And I think that the renewal to this case and to solving it offers a glimmer of hope. It offers something to say, like, hey, you know, we're paying attention to this and we care, and this is important to us, when, you know, hundreds of thousands of cases across the world are never given the time of day.
Yeah, and Kate, I imagine, you know, you hear these stories, you report on these stories, obviously. What does having a police department like the Boston Police Department reopen this case to make sure that they continue to, I guess, effort to find this murderer?
You know, I think it means a lot, and it means a lot to two different communities. One is Rita's immediate community. Her family had long lost hope. Her sister, Diana, and Diana's kids and extended family had stopped calling. They had become exhausted, and so this celebration of Transgender Day of Remembrance had been meaningful, but it had also been painful for them. And then the larger transgender community, of which I'm a part, it really says something when this murder that inspired this international movement of Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is an annual vigil that honors homicide victims, when the person that inspired that murder had never been solved. It really felt like it was a point of real pain, and it continues to be, that initial murder has never been solved, that we don't know what happened to her. If that one can't be solved, whose murder will be solved, right? It always felt like an injustice. for the whole community.
And that tension, as Chastity mentioned, between the police and the trans community continues to exist and be there.
It does, and I want to note, I don't think that this was done for a point of malice, but there continues to be a cultural incompetency. So when we got the statement from police, Rita's dead name, which was the male name she was assigned at birth, was in the statement, right? And so there's things that police have to do and learn in order to work with the trans community so that those communities can come together and solve this case. And there's healing that needs to happen in order for them to move forward.
Well, in Chastity's own words, we actually do have a soundbite where she is talking about the first time she heard about Rita Hester's story and the ongoing violence against trans people.
We're mourning all of these lives that we're taking of people who identify like me. So for me, it was really scary. It was eye-opening. It made me realize the type of precaution I have to take when going outside and leaving my house and type of events that I go to, because I realized that my life is not of value to a lot of people.
Yeah, and Tori, we also know statistically, if you are a Black trans person, the rates of homicide for those folks are even higher. And Chastity talking about her safety here, really, I think hits the nail on the head there, brings us home.
Yeah, I think they were reading the names, from across the world this year of trans people lost to violence, and I think there were 340 names, and that's just what has been reported. It's still underreported, right? We spoke to this researcher, Brendan Lance, who works out of this think tank at the University of Florida, and he has preliminary data where they're showing the disparity in clearance rates, so how they solve the crimes, and whether or not police, are able to solve the crimes. There's a lot of disparity there in demographic groups, huge demographic disparities. Black trans women, their cases are far less likely to be solved. And he wanted to kind of look at what impacts that. And one of the things that he connects in this preliminary data is whether or not police in their initial reporting, or, in Rita's case, it was the initial reporting and current day reporting, whether or not police dead name or misgender the victim. And that shows kind of a cultural issue within the department, but it also shows a lack of putting the work in to know the details. The disparity that he found from 10 years, looking at 10 years of data from the clearance rates, is that the national clearance rate from 2010 to 2021, so 11 years, was, I think, of just about 62%. And when you just limit that to trans people, it's 48. So there's a huge drop, right? And so he has this research preliminarily where it's just looking at what makes someone a victim in the eyes of society and the eyes of police, and if they're not a true victim, right, or their case isn't worth solving, what makes someone case worth solving? And there's just a huge gap there for these cases.
Yeah, and Kate, as we talk about the data that's out there, is there a willingness to have police departments train or retrain in your experience?
That's a very good question. A lot has changed in the 25 years since Rita was murdered, and there is growing cultural competency, but obviously we're not there yet. And transgender homicides have only increased, we've seen. And part of that, of course, is that more people report trans homicides. We're more aware of transgender people, but also the vitriol against trans people has also increased. We've seen more than 500 anti-transgender bills introduced into state legislatures over the last 3 years, and that has impacted the way that trans people go about living their lives. And it has also impacted violence against transgender people, particularly Black transgender women, women of color living in cities. And so it's very hard to say that things have gotten better, particularly in law enforcement, when we continue to see things like dead naming, when these murders happen and cases are not solved. And those numbers remain so high. So Is the feeling different about safety for trans people? It's really hard to say. I don't know that it is.
Yeah. You know, Chastity, in her own words, talked about living on borrowed time and protecting herself. And so we want to hear from her again.
At 38, I feel like I'm living on borrowed time. Like I'm not supposed to be here. And so I have to be myself authentically every day, regardless of what anyone has to say about me. But I also have to make sure I protect myself, because there's really no way to live. Who wants to wake up every day and wonder if they're going to make it back home just because of who they are?
Tori, just incredible, that soundbite there. You know, talk to me a little bit about, you know, when we gathered that sound, but also the meaning behind it there.
Yes, we were speaking at the Trans Day of Remembrance event, which Chastity organized. I think there's something that everybody that I spoke to about Rita throughout the reporting of this story, and Kate knows this, they've been reporting on Rita for years. There's something so radical and unfortunately provocative to people about trans joy or just existing, right? And when we spoke to Chastity, she was saying she'll say, "What do you want from me? What does society want from us?" Right? Like, if I perform myself in this way or that way, will I be in less danger? Because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about people's lives and dying by violent means. But there's something so radical about living out loud and about being yourself in the face of so much hate and just this world that doesn't accept you and makes you feel like you should be silenced or that you should not exist just for being yourself. So trans joy in the face of that is a radical political act, and that should be celebrated, but at the same time, nobody should have to do that. Like, people just want to live their lives. And Rita just wanted to live her life, and she did, and she lived so loudly, and she was just expressing herself, and she would perform, and she had just had this extremely big and joyous personality, and she was a friend to so many people. And I think, you know, it's just the framing, when we look at, you know, these murders and the way that people are violently killed, there is a framing that implies that people deserved it just for being who they are. I think that is current day. You know, we talk about, it's really hard to say, have things gotten better? Is there more acceptance? Current day, there's just so much vitriol and hate and violence in the face of trans existence, not even trans joy.
I'm even thoughtful of the language, like in trying to educate folks on the language for this community, for folks, even pronouns, even the term dead naming, like things like that. It seems like that ends up being a barrier to even compassion, which it shouldn't be.
Well, it's a question of, do you validate someone's existence? And I think as a reporter, sometimes we're asked to create false equivalencies, or we're asked to say, like, well, they say this and they say that, but ultimately we're talking about, do we validate, you know, in the process of reporting this story, several people have misgendered Kate, and it's just something that they have to deal with all the time on a day-to-day basis. And I think each time it's a little chip. I can't speak, you can speak more to it, but.
Yeah.
You know, I want to point out something about Transgender Day of Remembrance that I think is really important, which is that it's become this international day. It's very important for the transgender community. But I met a young person actually in Boston a couple of years ago working on the Yes on 3 campaign, which was about should Massachusetts keep non-discrimination protections.
Right.
And that young person said, the first thing that I learned about being trans was Transgender Day of Remembrance. It was about this community funeral. And I thought I would be dead by 24. And that struck me because that was the first time I really sat in transgender community. And I think it's the first time a lot of trans people find their community.
Right.
And there's been an effort to create other events, you know, Trans Week of Awareness and visibility, so that that's not the only thing that trans people have, but that's the way that a lot of trans people have come to find community and enter it, is through this sort of funeral. And we're trying to create other stories and other narratives. And I think it's really important because Rita did have a very joyful life. Her family accepted her, embraced her, and loved her. And that young person found community by organizing later. But I think it's like really important to think about, what does it mean that our trans young people are growing up thinking that they have an expiration date, and how do we change that?
Yeah, very well said. Thank you so much, Tori and Kate. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, after a gunman shot and killed 19 children and 2 teachers at the Robb Elementary School last year in Uvalde, Texas, serious questions were raised about what police did and did not do in the hour and 14 minutes before they ultimately stopped that shooter. That delay in response is the focus of a new documentary from Frontline.
We gotta get in there. We gotta get in there and just keep shooting.
In the immediate aftermath, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong.
Chain of command is everything, and it was not there.
None of us have never been in this type of situation.
Inside the Uvalde response uses real-time first-hand accounts and official body cam footage and audio to reconstruct the timeline of the shooting and its response, featuring witnesses and survivors to tell the story and highlight the lingering trauma that the town still faces. The film is in collaboration with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. I'm joined now by Lomi Kriel, who you saw in that clip there, a reporter with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune's Investigative initiative. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I know as a journalist as well, being right there, reporting, being in the midst of such a terrible tragedy is its own struggle in and of itself, let alone thinking about documenting it. Talk to me about your experience there.
So I've been reporting on Uvalde along with a team of others at ProPublica and the Texas Tribune basically since it happened. We, during the course of that reporting, obtained a significant amount of investigative material that had not been released to the public. We did several stories on that, but this latest collaboration with Frontline is really the result of the year putting this together, in addition to what we did, last year. So it's been very, very difficult. We've also obviously spent time in Uvalde, spoken with families, students, teachers, try to speak with police officers. And I think it all is really sad and infuriating.
Well, you mentioned infuriating. In your years of reporting, I mean, when you're thinking about this response to this shooting at an elementary school, was there anything that immediately, sort of stood out to you as you were reporting it during the shooting, after the shooting, and during the time of putting together this piece in the investigation?
So one of the things that we found in this most recent round of reporting, which really spanned all this year, was this incredible contrast between teachers and students are taught to remain quiet during active shooter drills, that is their best defense to keep them safe. And that's exactly what they did. That's what the teachers and students told not only us, but investigators themselves. And in contrast, we hear from the officers telling investigators that because that school wing was so quiet, they didn't think that there were children or teachers inside. So it's really this very disturbing contrast between the training that was followed by the students and teachers actually meant that officers were not able or did not realize that there were children inside and so did not respond faster.
I mean, it is remarkable. In fact, we have a clip of officers explaining how quiet it was in the hallway and why they thought that there was no one down there.
I honestly didn't think anybody was in there besides the gunman. I didn't hear any screaming, any yelling. I literally didn't hear anything at all. You would think there was, kids would be yelling and screaming.
We couldn't hear the kids. We couldn't hear him shooting anybody or anything like that. So I guess that's why they were waiting to make entry, because we didn't know what was going on in there. It was too quiet.
Did you think there was kids in that room?
I knew there was a possibility because of the school, but I didn't know for sure that there was kids in the room. I was like, maybe they're doing something else, not in their classrooms. But that was kind of wishful thinking.
And I'm also thoughtful of how remarkable this is, because active shooter training, it was not a new concept. before this Uvalde shooting. And so, as you mentioned, it seems like the staff and by extension, the children were doing what they were taught to do, but somehow the police officers had this disconnect.
Yeah, exactly. So what we also found in our reporting, which included going to active shooter training ourselves and, reviewing past botched or failed responses like Pulse or Parkland, was that a lot of the issues that Uvalde have happened before. In the terms of police thinking that it was a barricaded shooter, not an active shooter, in the sense of no one going immediately inside once they know that someone is hurt or possibly dying, which is literally the central tenet of their training: stop the killing, stop the dying. And the lack of incident command, not knowing who was in charge, the problems with communication. All of these things have happened to some degree before, but I think what happened in Uvalde is not only that all of them coagulated at once, but also, and this is very important, we have access now to not only the body camera footage that shows it in real time, but the interviews with law enforcement telling us how they thought it transpired, which is incredibly rare. This is rare in sort of a normal criminal investigation to get the complete file, but it is particularly rare in a mass shooting where that information is often kept secret for years if it's ever released.
Well, yeah, take us behind the curtain a little bit with this. How did you get access to these investigative materials?
So you know that we have sued the ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, along with a consortium of news organizations, have sued the state to try to get access to just basic information, like 911 calls that typically would be released in any kind of criminal investigation and a mass shooting. And that has, all of those requests have been denied because there's an ongoing criminal investigation as well into this response. So during the course of our reporting, we just, through a confidential source, were able to obtain a fairly significant amount of material from the investigative file. So that includes more than 150 interviews with law enforcement officers, student, teachers, photographs, 911 calls, radio calls, dispatch communications. And together we went through that with FRONTLINE as well, and sort of put together the key moments that we could decipher for this response.
You had mentioned that you, the team, have been reporting on this for a while now. When you bring this information back to the community, or the families, right? Like who see this, who are learning this as well, what has been their response and how do you manage that with them?
Yeah, so obviously Uvalde is, for your viewers who may not know, it's a small city of about 15,000 people in kind of southwest Texas, about more than an hour from San Antonio. This community has just been devastated, obviously, by what happened. Everybody there, it's a small city. Everyone knows each other. They see each other. There's one HEB, one main grocery store. Everybody goes to that grocery store. So it's just been incredibly devastating for them. They also just had one homicide the year before this happened. So this is not a community that is used to this kind of tragedy or violence in this way. So obviously the reporting was very difficult, but what we try to do along with the team that I reported with is, really talk to people, and every child that is named in the story, we've spoken with their parents. We've gotten consent to use their name, to identify them, to use any identifying footage or audio from them. The families overall want more accountability and they want more transparency. They want answers. They want to understand what happened that day. They feel that more than 18 months in, they still have very little idea. And so I think that they're grateful to get some answers from us, from this material that we've obtained, but they're still waiting for the official findings from investigators and from the district attorney herself.
And so many of them have actually become activists in this space as well.
That's right. A lot of them have become pretty active when it comes to gun control or things like, lowering the age for, raising the age for semi-automatic purchases. And then some of them have just retreated because they're just devastated by grief. So I think that's also something that we see that happens after after these things happen, is you have these kind of polar opposite responses. And it's just all very sad. Everybody deals with grief differently, and it's sort of an unimaginable grief that I don't think anyone can understand unless you've been through that.
And all through this, as someone who, as we sit in Boston, we watching it from the outside and seeing folks, sort of pointing fingers at each other. And it seems like there was no real resolution, or the resolution is ongoing in terms of the chain of command for the police department, the chain of command in state and local government. Is that sort of work on that level still being happening to try to figure out who's accountable, or do you get a sense that the higher ups in this space are trying to move on from this?
I think it's a mixed bag. Obviously, we're still waiting for the findings from the investigators to be released at all, and for whatever the district attorney is going to do with her criminal probe. I think within Uvalde, there has been sort of a divide between families that want to, the community that wants to move on and try to, not necessarily forget, but move on to other things. And the rest of the community that really feels that we can't move on until we have answers, and just are, devastated, angry, infuriated, wanting some accountability. We know that very few people have actually been publicly disciplined for their role in the response. There were more than 300 state, local, and federal agents that responded this day, and only about 5, less than a handful, have been publicly terminated. Others have been reassigned or retired, but not a significant number. And so I think that the quest for answers is still ongoing, and the quest for just even an acknowledgement of failure more broadly than what has occurred so far.
So often we just move on from these stories once they fall out of the news cycle, and you and the folks on the team there have stayed. Is there anything that sort of stays with you in this reporting as you continue to be immersed in what is a trauma on the entire community?
I mean, there's so many moments of this. This is a story I'll never forget. I don't think you can, when 10-year-olds were killed. I think that what really stands out in the documentary, and I think as well in the story, is just so many moments that should have prompted officers to respond differently. But also in the context of, as we spoke, Columbine happened, more than 2 decades ago, and it still seems like these failures are repeating themselves. And it feels like, as a community, as a nation, that we're not addressing the issues that we need to. And whether you think that's gun control or training or school hardening, it seems that none of it is working, because some of those failures keep happening.
And it's always devastating every single time. Lomi Kriel, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for your time.
Inside the Uvalde Response premieres tonight at 10 p.m. right here on GBH2 and at pbs.org. Well, that's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow. I'm Crystal Haynes. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Next time